The unbelievable request. Tom had always dreamed of going to an intergalactic university. The idea of studying with alien species from across the galaxy was exciting, but it was also terrifying. He had worked hard to get here, and now, as he walked through the grand halls of the university, he felt a mix of awe and fear. The walls were made of shimmering crystal, glowing softly in the light of distant stars. Alien students of every shape and size walked past him. Some floating, others walking on four legs. They didn't seem to notice Tom, but he couldn't help but stare. They were so different, yet they were all here for the same reason: to learn. Tom had never been the smartest student back on Earth, but he had one thing most of the others didn't: determination. He had struggled through countless late nights, studying harder than he ever thought possible, just to prove that a human could belong in a place like this. Today was an important day. His first class with Professor Vesa. She was one of the top professors at the university, known for her knowledge of alien biology and ancient cultures. She was an alien herself, a species from a distant planet. Tall and elegant, with blue skin that shimmered under the light, her species had eyes that glowed like tiny stars, and her voice was soft but commanding. When Tom walked into the classroom, he felt a wave of nervousness wash over him. The room was filled with other students, most of them alien, but all of them seemed calm and confident. Tom, on the other hand, felt out of place. He sat at a desk near the back, hoping to go unnoticed. Professor Vesa entered, and the room fell silent. She had a presence about her that commanded attention. Her eyes scanned the room, settling briefly on Tom. She smiled, but it wasn't the usual friendly smile. It was almost like she knew something Tom didn't. "Welcome," she said, her voice smooth and gentle. "Today we will begin learning about the unique ways different species interact with one another, and the fascinating rituals that bind us all together. I expect you to be open-minded, as you will be asked to participate in some unusual activities." Tom felt his heart race. He had no idea what she meant, but the idea of participating in anything unusual made him nervous. He had barely gotten used to being around aliens, let alone taking part in their strange customs. The class began, and Professor Vesa went on to explain the different rituals of various species. Some were peaceful, others were strange, and a few even seemed dangerous. Tom took notes, trying to keep up with the fast pace of the lecture, but his mind kept drifting. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this class, something he wasn't quite ready for. At the end of the lecture, Professor Vesa gave her usual calm smile as she told the students to leave. But then she looked directly at Tom. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I would like to speak with you after class." Tom's heart skipped a beat. He tried to ignore the nervous flutter in his stomach as the other students began to file out. He stayed seated, his mind racing with questions. What did she want? Was it something he had done wrong? When the room was empty, Professor Vesa approached him. Her eyes were soft, but there was something calculating in them. She seemed to be studying him, as if she were seeing more than just a human student. "Come with me," she said, and turned toward the door. Tom quickly followed, his curiosity growing. They walked down a long corridor, far from the busy classrooms. The walls here were more metallic, and the air felt cooler. Tom's footsteps echoed as they moved deeper into the building. Finally, they stopped in front of a small, quiet room. Professor Vesa turned to him, her face serious. "I have an unusual request, Mr. Harris," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Tom's stomach nodded. He had no idea what was coming, but he had a feeling it wouldn't be something ordinary. "Here, we learn more than just science and history," she continued, her voice calm, but with a strange undertone. "Some of our species have rituals that are deeply personal, and sometimes humans are needed to help us with them." Tom blinked, not sure where this was going. He had heard stories of alien rituals, but they had always seemed like something out of a sci-fi movie. Was this one of those stories? "I need your help with something," Professor Vesa said, her voice serious but without a trace of hesitation. "It's an ancient practice from my home planet, a task that only a human can assist with." Tom opened his mouth to ask what she meant, but before he could speak, she raised a hand to silence him. "Before you say anything, let me explain. It's harmless, but I need someone I can trust. This is not a test, Mr. Harris. It is a task that has been passed down for generations, and I believe you are the right person for it." Tom was confused and his mind raced with questions. What kind of task could she be talking about? Why him? Professor Vesa took a deep breath and then said something that made Tom's heart stop. "I need you to milk me." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Tom didn't know what to say. His mind spun, trying to understand what he had just heard. Did she really say what he thought she said? Professor Vesa's eyes were steady as she watched him, waiting for his response. Tom's thoughts were in chaos, but one thing was clear: this was unlike anything he had ever imagined. Confusion and curiosity. Tom stood frozen in the small, dimly lit room, his heart pounding in his chest. The words Professor Vesa had just spoken echoed in his mind over and over. "Milk me." He blinked, trying to make sense of it. His brain was struggling to process what he had just heard. This was an alien, a professor at an intergalactic university, asking him to do something he couldn't even begin to understand. He tried to speak, but his mouth felt dry, his tongue heavy in his mouth. "Do you what?" was all he managed to stammer. Professor Vesa remained calm, her glowing eyes never leaving his. "It's a simple practice. Nothing harmful, I promise you," she said softly. Her tone was reassuring, but Tom couldn't shake the confusion that clouded his mind. Was this some sort of test, a strange cultural tradition, or was it something else entirely? Tom glanced around the room. The walls were lined with strange artifacts, some glowing with a faint, pulsating light, others shaped in ways he couldn't begin to comprehend. The room felt too quiet, too distant from the bustling classrooms. He suddenly felt like he was far away from everything he knew, his old life, his Earth, even his sense of self. "I don't understand," Tom said, his voice shaky. "What do you mean? Milk you? Why me?" Professor Vesa sighed softly, her expression unreadable. She didn't seem offended by his confusion. Instead, she looked almost understanding. "I know this is hard to believe. You must be wondering if this is a joke or some kind of misunderstanding. It is not. On my home planet, there are customs that are vital to our survival, and humans have a unique connection to our biology." Tom swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had read about alien species having strange customs and rituals, but nothing could have prepared him for this. He had no idea how to respond. He thought about running without telling her no, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Maybe it was her calmness, her confidence, or maybe it was the way her eyes seemed to see straight through him, like she knew everything about him and still believed he could do this. "You see," she continued, stepping closer, "on my planet, we have a special bond with humans. You have something that we need, something that only you can provide. This task, though it may seem strange, is necessary for both our species." Tom took a step back, trying to process her words. His heart was still racing. He had been to Earth, seen some strange customs, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. What do you want me to do?" His voice barely rose above a whisper. Professor Vesa's face softened, and she placed a hand gently on his shoulder. Her touch was warm, almost comforting. "I won't lie to you. It's a delicate task, one that requires trust. But you are the one I have chosen, Mr. Harris." Tom wanted to say something, to protest, to ask more questions, but the words just wouldn't come. His mind was swimming with images of alien creatures, unfamiliar landscapes, and ancient rituals that he could never have prepared for. "You are the first human to ever be invited to take part in this," Professor Vesa said, her voice almost like a whisper. "Your presence will not only help me, but will help my entire species. It's more than just a task. It's a key, a key to something that will ensure the survival of both our worlds. Tom stared at her, his mind spinning. What kind of key? He asked, though he wasn't sure he was ready to hear the answer. She took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing slightly as she glanced at the strange devices and objects around the room. You've heard of the genetic link between humans and other species, haven't you? The ways in which different species can share and benefit from each other's biology. It's an ancient practice from my planet, passed down for generations. Tom nodded slowly, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had heard of things like this before. Aliens trading DNA, humans offering something valuable to other species. But he had never imagined he would be asked to take part in it himself. It all seemed too surreal. Professor Vessa's gaze softened again as she took another step closer. This will only be for a short time, Mr. Harris. After it's done, everything will go back to normal. You will have fulfilled your purpose, and you will leave this room unchanged. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. She was telling him this like it was some sort of duty, some sacred obligation. But nothing felt normal about this. Nothing felt safe. Still, despite his doubts and confusion, something about the professor's calm demeanor seemed to pull him in. Her conviction, the way she spoke as though she knew exactly what would happen next, it all made him feel small, insignificant, and yet strangely important at the same time. You don't have to do it, she added, her voice more gentle now. But think carefully, Mr. Harris. You are here for a reason. I am offering you a rare opportunity, one that very few humans will ever have. The question is, will you rise to meet it? The silence in the room was thick with tension. Tom's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, fear, confusion, curiosity, and the strange pull of something deeper inside him. He wanted to walk away, to refuse, to go back to his normal life. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a strange request. It was the beginning of something much bigger. He took a deep breath, his eyes locking with hers. What exactly do I need to do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Professor Vessa smiled, the faintest hint of satisfaction in her eyes. I'll show you, she said, and motioned for him to follow her further into the room. As they walked, Tom's stomach churned. The unknown lay ahead, and there was no turning back. The offer. The room was small, yet filled with strange, alien machinery. Glowing tubes, metal instruments that hummed softly, and crystalline panels that seemed to shift with the light. Tom felt a growing sense of unease as he followed Professor Vessa deeper into the chamber. The walls, pulsating with a faint blue light, seemed to close in on him, making everything feel more intimate, more real. The air smelled faintly of something sweet and foreign, like a flower that had never bloomed on Earth. Tom's heart raced as his mind tried to make sense of it all. He couldn't help but feel like a rabbit caught in the predator's gaze. He had never been in a situation like this before. Every moment seemed to stretch on forever, each second heavier than the last. There was no going back now. Whatever was about to happen, he was already too far in to walk away. Professor Vessa stopped in front of a large cylindrical device. It stood tall in the center of the room, its surface smooth and reflective, like a glass cocoon. She turned to face Tom, her glowing eyes never leaving him. Before we begin, Mr. Harris, she said softly, I need you to understand something. What you're about to do is not just for my people. It's for yours as well. Tom blinked in confusion. What do you mean? How does this benefit humanity? His voice shook, but he couldn't help himself. His head was full of questions, and this whole situation was spiraling out of control. Professor Vessa's expression softened, though there was an edge to her words. There are things about this universe that humans have yet to understand, Tom. The ancient species, the ones that created this university, the ones that created the systems we live by. They had a plan that involves both your kind and mine. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. You may not know it yet, but humans have an important role to play in the future of all species. Tom's mind whirled. He wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Was this some kind of elaborate scheme? Or was there really something bigger at play? Could humans really have a special role in the future of the galaxy? He had come here to learn, to study, but now it felt like he had stepped into something far more dangerous, something far more complex than his limited understanding of the universe could grasp. He tried to focus on her words, tried to force himself to listen to reason, but his mind kept drifting back to the same question. What did she mean by milk me? Professor Vesa seemed to read his thoughts. "I know what you're thinking," she said, her voice almost motherly. "You don't understand what it means. But I promise you, this is something that can only be done by a human. I've chosen you because you are willing to see the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." Tom didn't know whether to feel honored or terrified. What was this truth she kept speaking of? And why him? What was it about his humanity that made him the one? He had no special training, no extraordinary talents, just determination. So why him? "I don't understand," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. Professor Vesa placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her fingers cool but oddly reassuring. "You will, soon enough," she said. "But first, we need to begin." She gestured to the cylindrical device, which had begun to hum softly, its lights blinking in rhythmic patterns. The air around it seemed to thrum with energy. Tom felt his skin prickle, his instincts screaming at him to run, to get away from this place. But he stood there, frozen, unable to move, caught in the strange pull of the professor's gaze. "This is where the task will begin," she explained. "This device has been designed to facilitate the connection between our species, to allow the sharing of our biological needs." Tom stared at her, confused. "I don't get it. What do you need from me?" Professor Vesa's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's not just about the biological process, Tom. It's about connection. The exchange that happens between us is complex. There are energies, emotions that are passed through this ritual. It's a form of bonding, not just physically, but on a deeper level." Tom's head spun. "Bonding? What do you mean by that?" The professor's smile was slow, almost mysterious. "You will understand soon. But for now, just trust me." She stepped closer to the device and pressed a glowing panel on the side. The cylindrical structure hummed louder, and the walls of the room seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The air became thick, like it was charged with static electricity. Tom's hair stood on end. "Step forward," she urged, her voice now softer, more coaxing. "You will not be harmed. I promise you. This will only take a moment." Tom's mind screamed at him to run, but his feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. The professor's calm demeanor, her steady gaze, the strange energy of the room, it all kept him rooted in place. Slowly, hesitantly, he stepped toward the device. As he moved closer, he noticed that the air around it seemed to shimmer, the temperature dropping slightly. There was something about the whole room that felt alive, like it was waiting for him. When he stood in front of the device, Professor Vesa moved behind him and placed her hands on his shoulders. She leaned in, her breath cool against his neck. "You must trust me, Tom," she whispered. "This is the beginning of something much greater, for both of us." Tom shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of her words. The atmosphere in the room seemed to press in on him, the energy surrounding them growing stronger, almost tangible. His instincts screamed at him again, but he pushed those thoughts aside. There was no turning back now. As the professor's hands gently guided him forward, Tom couldn't help but wonder what would happen when this was all over. What kind of connection would this create? And what price would he have to pay for it? The humming of the device grew louder, more urgent. Tom's heart raced as he took a deep breath. And, for the first time in his life, he stepped into the unknown. The ritual begins. Tom's heart hammered in his chest as he stood before the strange device, feeling its energy pulse through the room like a living, breathing entity. The air around him was thick with the unspoken tension, charged with the weight of an ancient tradition. He could feel every inch of his body vibrating, as if the universe itself was aligning for this moment. His body was telling him to turn around to run, but his feet were glued to the floor, and his mind was too full of questions to move. Professor Vessa's hands remained lightly on his shoulders, her touch firm yet gentle. He could sense the calm in her movements, the unshakable certainty that she had done this before, countless times. But Tom, he was trembling, fighting the overwhelming feeling that he was on the edge of something irreversible, something that would change him forever. She leaned in closer, her breath cool against his ear, her voice a soft whisper. "It's starting now, Tom. Focus. Stay with me." The humming from the device grew louder, resonating in his bones. Tom couldn't help but wonder if the walls themselves were alive, reacting to the ritual about to unfold. His breath caught in his throat as the smooth surface of the cylinder began to glow brighter, shifting colors from deep violet to an eerie, luminescent blue. It was as if the device was waking up, preparing itself for whatever was about to happen. What's going to happen? Tom's voice cracked as he spoke, his nerves getting the better of him. Professor Vessa's grip tightened ever so slightly, a reassuring gesture, though her expression remained unreadable. "You will not remember much of this, Tom. The process is overwhelming. But when it's over, you will understand." Tom wanted to ask more questions, wanted to demand explanations, but the moment seemed to demand silence. His mind was already spinning with uncertainty, and there was no room left for anything but the strange sense of destiny that hung in the air. Without warning, the device whirred, its energy output increasing rapidly. The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls warping as though the very fabric of reality was bending in response to the machine's power. Tom's pulse quickened. He felt a cold shiver creep down his spine. Every instinct told him that this was it, the moment that would change everything. Professor Vessa's voice was steady and calming as she spoke again. "Trust the process, Tom. Let it happen." She stepped back slightly, her eyes not leaving him for a second. The moment she moved, the device activated. A soft but sharp beam of light shot from the cylindrical structure, striking the center of Tom's chest. He gasped, the sensation like a sudden shock of electricity coursing through his body. It wasn't painful, at least not in the way he expected, but it was an overwhelming sensation, as if something was being drawn from him, something deep within his soul. His vision blurred, the edges of the room twisting as the light seemed to expand, swallowing everything around him. The world around him felt distant, detached, as if he were floating in some infinite, empty space. He could feel a strange pull inside him, something foreign but familiar at the same time. And then, for a moment, it all stopped. The silence was deafening. Tom blinked, finding himself back in the small room. The device had dimmed, its glow fading as the hum softened into nothingness. But something was different. His body felt lighter, somehow. His heart, which had been racing only moments before, was now calm. His thoughts felt clearer, more focused, as if a fog had been lifted from his mind. What happened?" Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. Professor Vessa didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "The bond has been made," she said, her voice low and full of something Tom couldn't place. "You have connected with me, Tom. But the ritual isn't complete yet." Tom's mind raced as he tried to process her words. The bond has been made. What did that mean? Was this some kind of mental connection? He didn't feel any different, not physically anyway. But deep down, in a place he couldn't quite reach, he could sense something had changed. Something was different between them. "You'll begin to feel the effects soon," Professor Vessa continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "It will be like a connection, something that links our thoughts, our emotions. You'll know what I feel, and I'll know what you feel. It's the next step in the process." Tom shook his head, trying to make sense of it all. "You mean we're connected, like psychically?" She nodded slowly, her glowing eyes flickering with a depth of meaning that sent a chill down his spine. Yes, Tom, you will be able to sense me, even when we're far apart. And I will feel your presence too. Tom's stomach twisted at the thought. He had read about telepathy in science fiction stories, but this felt different, real, tangible. He could already feel a strange tug inside him, like a thread pulling him toward the professor. He didn't like it. He didn't know how to control it. It was as though she was already in his mind, an invasive presence that couldn't be ignored. Professor Vesa continued, "This connection is crucial. It's the first step in something much larger, Tom. You have been chosen to play a part in the survival of both of our species, and what we share now will bind us together in ways you can't yet understand." Tom took a step back, his thoughts swirling. Survival. He had no idea what she was talking about, but he was beginning to understand that whatever this was, it was far bigger than anything he had imagined, far bigger than his simple existence on Earth. The professor's gaze softened, and she placed her hand on his shoulder once again. "It's a lot to process, I know. But we are bound now, Tom. And when the time comes, you will know what to do." Tom looked at her, his mind racing, his pulse still elevated. He didn't know how to respond. The weight of her words was heavy, and the connection between them, though still faint, was undeniable. The silence stretched between them, and in that silence, Tom began to feel the stirrings of something inside him, something unfamiliar but powerful. He wasn't sure he wanted to feel it, but it was there, growing stronger with each passing moment. He had crossed a line, and he knew, deep down, that there was no turning back now. The revelation. The air in the room felt thick, charged with an energy that Tom could almost taste. Every movement, every breath seemed amplified, echoing in the silence that stretched between him and Professor Vesa. The connection they had formed, it was strange, uncomfortable, and far more powerful than he could have imagined. He could feel her presence, like an invisible thread linking his mind to hers. It wasn't just a bond. It was a pull, an unspoken tether that was starting to tighten with every passing second. Tom rubbed his forehead, trying to shake off the feeling that something was growing inside him, something that wasn't his own. It felt like her emotions, her thoughts, were bleeding into his. He could almost hear her, even when she wasn't speaking. Focus, he told himself. Stay calm. But the truth was, he had no idea how to control this. The professor was watching him carefully, her gaze unwavering. She seemed patient, as if she knew exactly what was happening to him, even if he didn't. And that thought alone sent a ripple of fear down his spine. "Are you feeling it yet?" she asked softly, her voice gentle but firm. "The connection, the bond we share." Tom's chest tightened, and he exhaled shakily. He didn't want to admit it, but he could feel her presence, like an imprint on his very thoughts. He couldn't block her out. He didn't know how. I don't know what's happening," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It feels like you're in my head. I can sense you." Professor Vesa nodded slowly, a small, knowing smile crossing her face. "That's exactly it. Our minds are linked now, Tom. And that connection will only grow stronger as we progress. It's not just a simple bond. This is something much deeper. It's an exchange of thoughts, of emotions. It's the beginning of something larger." Tom could barely keep up. "Larger? What do you mean? What's this all about?" The professor sighed, the smile fading from her face. She stepped closer to him, her eyes now filled with something darker, more serious. "You're not just here to learn, Tom. You're not just here for the knowledge of the stars or the ancient civilizations of the galaxy. You've been brought here for a purpose that involves not just your survival, but the survival of all your people." Tom felt a shiver crawl up his spine. What are you talking about?" She paused for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she reached out and touched his forehead with her fingers, her skin cool but strangely comforting. A wave of energy seemed to wash over him, and suddenly his mind flooded with images that weren't his own. For a split second, it felt like he was drowning in a torrent of alien memories, fragments of distant worlds, the rise and fall of civilizations, battles fought in the stars, strange technologies and rituals long forgotten. It was overwhelming, like trying to process a lifetime of history in an instant. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. Tom gasped, his breath ragged, his body trembling from the intensity of the vision. His mind felt like it had been pulled apart and put back together again. What? What was that? He whispered, his voice shaking. Professor Vesa stepped back, her expression unreadable. That, Tom, was a glimpse of the future and the past. The vision you just saw is a fraction of what's to come. It's the legacy of my people, of the ancients who created the systems we live by. But it's not just their history, it's yours too. Tom struggled to catch his breath, trying to steady himself. My history, but how? I'm just. No, she interrupted gently. You're not just anything. You're one of the few who can understand what's coming. You're the key to saving humanity, and to saving the galaxy. Tom's mind reeled. Saving humanity. Saving the galaxy? From what? Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she took a step forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. There are threats out there, Tom. Forces beyond comprehension, entities that seek only destruction. The galaxy has always been in balance, but that balance is now shifting. And your species, humanity, is the last line of defense. Tom blinked in disbelief. Us? How are we supposed to stop them? We're just humans. Professor Vesa's eyes glowed faintly as she stared at him, her expression intense. That's what makes you so dangerous. You have something the others don't. Resilience. A drive to survive. A refusal to be defeated. The ancients believed it was your greatest strength. They created a plan, Tom. A plan for humanity to rise above the darkness that is coming. And you're part of that plan. Tom's heart pounded as he tried to process everything she was telling him. But why me? Why did you choose me? The professor's gaze softened, and she placed a hand on his arm. Because you have something unique, Tom. You have the will to question, to seek answers even when you don't have them. That makes you stronger than any of the others. And now, with the connection we share, you will begin to understand what must be done. For a moment, Tom could only stare at her in stunned silence. This wasn't what he had expected. He had come to learn about alien cultures, to study the stars and history. But he had never imagined this. He wasn't ready for it. He didn't know how to be. The connection between us is just the beginning, she continued, her voice growing softer, more intimate. The ritual we started today will allow us to share not just our minds, but our strengths. You'll learn to harness the power within you, the power that humanity has yet to tap into. Tom shook his head, his mind a blur of confusion. I don't understand. What do you mean by harness the power within me? I'm just a student. Professor Vesa smiled faintly, her eyes full of unspoken knowledge. You'll see soon enough, Tom. You've already begun the process. You'll feel it in your body and in your mind. The change is already happening. Tom's chest tightened again as he felt something shift deep inside him, a faint tug at the edge of his consciousness, like a door slowly opening to something he couldn't quite comprehend. You're ready, Professor Vesa said quietly, stepping back. And soon, the world will be too. But first, you need to understand what's at stake. Only then will you be able to help humanity rise up. As her words sank in, Tom felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, harder than ever before. This wasn't just about learning anymore. This was about survival, about a fight that would span the stars. And somehow, he was at the center of it all. The awakening. The days following the ritual blurred together. Tom felt different, changed, though he couldn't quite put his finger on how. His thoughts weren't his own anymore, not entirely. There was a constant hum in the back of his mind, a subtle presence that he couldn't ignore, but it didn't feel oppressive. In fact, it was almost comforting. It was as if Professor Vesa was always there, just out of reach, guiding him with every decision, every thought. At night, when the dorms were silent, Tom would close his eyes and feel the pull, an invisible thread that seemed to connect him to her. He could sense her every movement, her emotions rippling across the bond between them like gentle waves on a calm sea. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but the more time passed, the stronger it became. He could feel her frustrations, her triumphs, even her fears. Fears that she never let show on the surface. One evening, after a particularly long and draining lecture about ancient alien civilizations, Tom found himself in his dorm room, staring out at the stars through his window. He had never been one to dwell on the mysteries of the universe, but now, everything seemed so connected, so much more than the textbooks and lectures. His gaze drifted across the distant stars, and for the first time, he felt an unsettling sense of urgency. There was something out there, something waiting, something that threatened everything. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the overwhelming feeling, but it wouldn't go away. Instead, it grew stronger, more intense. Then, suddenly, he felt it, a surge of energy pulsing through the connection, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The bond flared to life, a burst of light and sensation that nearly knocked him off his feet. His heart raced, his chest constricting as he gasped for air. It was Professor Vesa. Her presence flooded his mind, sharp and immediate. "Tom, it's happening. The first wave is coming. Prepare yourself." Her voice was urgent, yet oddly calm, like a captain giving orders during a storm. He could feel her thoughts, each one laced with a quiet determination. She wasn't afraid, at least not outwardly. But there was something in the way her presence pulsed, something primal that told him she was on edge. "Prepare myself," he whispered aloud, his voice shaky. For what? Before he could think further, a harsh knock at the door broke through the tension. Tom's heart skipped a beat as he stood up, his body still trembling from the intensity of the bond. He wasn't sure if it was his own nerves or the energy from the connection, but the knock felt like a drumbeat, echoing in his chest. "Tom," came the muffled voice from the other side. It was a fellow student from the research program. "You okay in there? We've got a situation." He froze. Something about the tone in the voice, the urgency, made his skin crawl. With a final glance at the stars outside, he rushed to the door and flung it open. A tall, nervous-looking student stood in the hallway, his eyes wide with alarm. "There's a message. From the council." Tom blinked, confused. The council? What? The student's face was pale, his mouth set in a grim line. "You need to see this. Everyone's been called to the main hall." Tom didn't need any more words. He followed the student without hesitation, his feet moving almost on their own as his mind raced. The bond with Vesa pulsed once more, and he could feel her, urging him forward, as though time itself was running out. When they reached the main hall, a large group of students had gathered, their faces etched with confusion and worry. At the center of the room stood Professor Vesa, her usually calm demeanor replaced with something more intense. She didn't look at Tom as he entered, but the moment he stepped into the room, he could feel her focus shift entirely to him. It was like a magnetic pull, and he couldn't look away from her. A large holographic screen flickered to life at the front of the hall, casting an eerie glow on the gathered students. The image was grainy at first, but it soon focused into a clear transmission. An alien face, strange and angular, with eyes that glowed a piercing red. "This is an emergency transmission to all affiliated civilizations." The alien voice crackled through the speakers. The tone was cold, mechanical, and utterly devoid of emotion. "We are the Sulthor Collective. We have been observing your planet. You have 30 cycles to surrender your species to us. Failure to comply will result in immediate annihilation." A stunned silence fell over the room, the alien voice continuing its chilling message. "We will begin our advance in 5 cycles. Your species is weak. You are unprepared. We will offer no further warning." The transmission ended with a sudden flash of static, and the room remained in stunned silence for several moments. Tom's heart pounded in his chest, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. His mouth went dry, and for a moment, he felt like he couldn't breathe. This was it, the threat they had been preparing for. The first wave was coming. What do we do?" A voice broke the silence from one of the students. Professor Vesa stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room, her voice calm but laced with an undeniable edge of authority. "We fight. We will not bow to them. We will stand our ground, and we will do what it takes to protect humanity. But to do that, we need to prepare." Tom's mind raced, his thoughts bouncing from one thing to the next. The Sulfur Collective. They were real, and they were coming. But why did Professor Vesa seem so certain? What was it about this connection between them? Was it part of the reason she wasn't afraid? "Tom." Professor Vesa's voice cut through his thoughts, drawing him back to the present. Her eyes met his, and he felt a sudden surge of understanding pass between them, like a floodgate opening in his mind. It's time. The rituals, the preparation. It has all led to this moment. You are ready. Ready. Tom wanted to ask what that meant, but the words stuck in his throat. What did she mean by that? Before he could respond, the door to the hall slammed open, and a group of military personnel rushed in, their uniforms crisp, their faces grim. They wasted no time in addressing the gathered students. "The Sulfur Collective's fleet is already on the move. You all have a role to play now. This isn't just about survival anymore. This is a war." Tom's world tilted. This was real. It wasn't some theory, some lecture. This was happening. The Sulfur were coming, and humanity was about to be thrust into a battle for its very existence. The final choice. The weight of the moment settled over Tom like a thick, suffocating fog. The room, once filled with uncertainty and confusion, now pulsed with an energy that was impossible to ignore. The threat of the Sulfur Collective loomed large, and everyone present knew that there was no time left for doubt or hesitation. The military personnel, who had entered with grim authority, now stood in the center of the hall, delivering orders and plans with cold precision. Tom's heart raced as he tried to wrap his mind around the enormity of what had just happened. He had known that something was coming, something that would change everything. But this was beyond anything he could have prepared for. And yet, in the midst of it all, a strange calmness began to wash over him, a quiet assurance that grew with every passing second. It was as if the connection between him and Professor Vesa had unlocked something within him, something primal and powerful. "You've all been called to serve," one of the officers said, his voice sharp and commanding. "Your talents, your skills, are all needed. The Sulfur Collective will not show mercy, and we will not go down without a fight. We have developed a plan to strike back, but we need every single one of you to make it happen." Tom could feel Professor Vesa's presence beside him, a soft pulse of energy that anchored him in the chaos of the room. He glanced at her, meeting her eyes for the first time since the transmission had ended. There was no fear in her gaze, only certainty. "Tom," she said softly, her voice just for him. "This is what we've been preparing for. You are more ready than you think. The bond we share, it's not just a connection. It's the key to everything. It's what will allow you to fight alongside us." Tom's chest tightened as her words sank in. She was right. He had known it deep down. The rituals, the tests, the strange sensations he'd felt, they had all been leading to this moment. He wasn't just a student anymore. He wasn't just a bystander in this fight. He was part of something far bigger, something that could change the fate of humanity. The military officers were now laying out the battle plans, but Tom wasn't listening. His mind was elsewhere. His thoughts were with Vesa, and the connection between them. He could feel the surge of power deep within him, a force that he still didn't fully understand but knew he had to embrace. It was time to stop questioning and start acting. The Xalthor were coming, and there was no turning back. "Vesa," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the clamor in the room. "What do I need to do?" She gave him a small, knowing smile. "It's time to step into your role, Tom. Everything you've learned, everything you've experienced, has been leading to this. You will fight not only for survival but for the future of your species. The connection you and I share will allow you to tap into something that no one else can. It will give you the strength to fight back." Tom's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about winning. It was about ensuring that humanity could stand against the threat of extinction. The weight of the responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders, but for the first time since this all began, he didn't feel afraid. He felt ready. The officers turned toward Tom and Vesa, their eyes narrowing as if they had just noticed their exchange. "Professor Vesa, Tom," one of them said. His tone clipped. "You've been chosen to lead one of the strike teams. We need every advantage we can get, and your knowledge, your abilities, are essential." Tom's stomach clenched at the mention of leading a team. He wasn't ready for that. He wasn't even sure he could command anyone. But when he looked at Vesa, her calm demeanor and unwavering confidence filled him with a sense of purpose. "I'll do it," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. "We'll do it." A few of the officers exchanged glances, then nodded, clearly relieved to see his resolve. "Good. The enemy is already mobilizing. You'll leave within the hour." Tom felt the energy in the room shift as the final preparations were made. He and Vesa were ushered into a small, secure room where they would be briefed on the details of the mission. The space was stark and utilitarian, with walls lined with holographic screens that displayed battle strategies and weapon systems. It was a world Tom had never imagined he'd be a part of. Vesa placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him as she spoke softly, just for him. "I'm proud of you, Tom. You've come so far, and now you'll lead us into the fight. But remember, this is only the beginning. The Xalthor will test you in ways you can't yet comprehend. They will push you to your limits, but you have something they don't: humanity's resilience. Never forget that." Tom nodded, though his mind raced with questions. How was he supposed to lead a team? How was he supposed to tap into the power she was talking about? It was a lot to take in all at once. Vesa must have sensed his hesitation, for she smiled and gave him a reassuring squeeze. "Trust in yourself, Tom. You are more capable than you think. And I'll be here every step of the way." He swallowed hard and squared his shoulders. He was about to face an enemy unlike any he had ever imagined. The Xalthor were ruthless, relentless, and far more advanced than anything humanity had ever encountered. But now, with the connection he shared with Vesa, and with the knowledge she had passed on to him, Tom felt something stir deep inside. It wasn't just about survival. It was about the future of his people. It was about proving that humanity could stand against the darkness of the stars. The time for hesitation was over. The time for questions was over. It was time to act. As the door to the briefing room slid open and the military officers filed in, Tom took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to take his place in the battle for the future of humanity. His mind was clear, his heart was steady, and he knew one thing for certain: no matter the cost, humanity would not fall.